Grant, what came of today's supply and demand estimate reports from the USDA?
Well, USDA had their report that came out today, and they ended up reducing our soybean exports, U.S. soybean exports, by 60 million bushels. That in turn has raised our carryout up to 530 million bushels of soybeans. And that wasn't unexpected. We did anticipate that exports numbers were going to be reduced a little bit, mainly because of the very large Brazilian soybean crop from this past season. And they've been able to export a little bit longer into the marketing year than normal. But overall, exports are still relatively strong if you look at it over a 3 to 5 year trend average. We're still looking at exporting over 2.1 billion bushels of soybeans this next year. And so that's kind of what the main news from this report.
What are we looking at weather-wise in South America? Do we need to keep an eye on that?
Well, it's interesting. USDA didn't adjust the price range for this report, and I think some of that has to do with global carryover actually was reduced, oilseed carryover and soybean carryover, so that helped offset some of the negative news in the U.S. And then the other piece of it is weather. It's been dry in places like Argentina and also other areas of the world that produce soybeans like India and Paraguay and Uruguay. And so they're reducing some of their soybean production estimates in those countries, and that's why the global oilseed estimates have been reduced a little bit. Now Brazil, on the other hand, looks pretty good right now, and so they're going to have a pretty large crop if the weather continues. But there's still a lot of growing season ahead of us, and there's variability in this growing season. It is a La Nina year, which tends to have less predictability in the type of weather that we're going to get. The weather tends to be a little bit more challenging in this kind of weather environment. So we'll have to wait and see what's going on with the actual harvest later.
What do we do from a demand standpoint given these high ending stocks?
So we have to just continue to work through our partners that we have through the U.S. Soybean Export Council, the U.S. Meat Export Federation, other entities that are working on behalf of U.S. agriculture to enhance our exports. So we'll continue to do that. U.S. Soybean Export Council is active in over 80 countries around the world. They're continually working in those markets to grow U.S. soybean exports. We have several trade missions planned for later on this winter, where we'll be meeting with buyers and bringing buyers and sellers together to try to continue to grow that overall trend. So hopefully we can turn that around and maybe bump these numbers back up before it's all said and done at the end of the year.
And what about happening on the domestic level here with livestock production?
Livestock production in the U.S. is still going strong. We're seeing growth in all the major sectors. The soybean crush market is looking very positive right now. So overall domestic demand is doing what it needs to do, but it's getting to the point where where the growth is still going to be occurring is going to be overseas. So it's going to be a balance between continuing to grow our domestic markets and our demand here with the livestock sector, and then also working overseas to enhance those exports.
Commodities analyst Sue Martin was pretty bullish at the ISA Farmer Research Conference this week. What do you think from her takeaways that should farmers keep in mind?
We have a lot of growing season ahead of us. We're moving into a more volatile weather period. And I think that's something that Sue Martin was looking at in some of her numbers. She looks at the trends. One interesting fact is if you look at all the refugee movements that we're seeing around the world right now, we're seeing over 20 to 25 million people that are on the move. And typically, and I hadn't thought about this before, but typically when you go into these refugee camps and then people get reestablished in new settlements, their calorie intake actually increases. So there's additional food demand that is required to manage these kinds of situations. And so that should also impact overall food demand, and that's something that I don't think is on very many people's radar. So it's something to keep an eye on later this year. But again, the initial catalyst is probably going to be a weather event someplace in the world, whether that's South America, North America, or someplace else. And so we'll have to keep an eye on that.
Perfect. In the meantime, what can we expect prices to do?
The price range looks to be going to continue in the zone that we've been in here over the last several months. And USDA reconfirmed that today by not adjusting the midpoint of their price range any. So you're going to see prices range in the low $9 area to the $10 area, and I think that's the range that we can expect at this point without any other major new information that changes things in the market.